Welcome back. In the past couple of months, we have received quite a few questions from you, our viewers, on the issue of homosexuality. How is homosexuality discussed in the Quran? As a community, how can we promote an inclusive environment for all while still staying true to our beliefs and values? Joining me is Dr. Shabir Ally to explore this topic further. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So what does the Quran say about homosexuality?
Actually, surprisingly, there is nothing directly mentioned in the Quran about homosexuality in particular. The Quran, of course, tells us about guarding our private parts, except for the legal manners of expressing our sexual urges, the notable form being in a legally sanctioned marriage according to the Quranic rules and dictates. And usually the marriage is between a man and a woman. So one can infer from this that homosexuality is, it seems implied that this is excluded in principle. There is a verse in the Quran which may be interpreted as referring to homosexuality as a prescriptive verse in Surah 4, verses number 15 and 16, where it mentions if two persons commit fahisha, which is like sexual impropriety, and here the two persons could be interpreted as a man and a woman, or grammatically it could refer to two men as well, and this is not entirely clear. But in any case, it says that if two persons commit sexual immorality, then they should both be punished, but the specific punishment is not mentioned. The story of the Prophet Lot and his people is often cited as referring to homosexual behavior, but in fact what is given in the Quran is a long list of crimes that these people have committed and for which eventually they were punished. Homosexual acts only being one of those in the list of crimes that they have committed.
So can Muslims say that they have, they're someone who identify with with a homosexual orientation per se?
Well, the Quran does not actually go into details about the difference between the orientation and the intimate act. And so to differentiate between the two, we must draw on modern views, especially scientific views, and other discussions about the origins of homosexual orientation. So what is recognized widely in modern times is that a person may feel a certain attraction to a person of the same sex. In fact, we know that in traditional times, people just thought of male and female as being dichotomous, either male or female. Now we know that there is a wide range of variation among human beings, and some are very macho male and some are very feminine, and in between you have some blurring of the distinctions. It seems that the Quran also takes note of this possibility that some people are not attracted to persons of the other sex. In the Quran, in the 24th chapter, some mention is made of those persons to whom a woman would be allowed to reveal some of the parts of her body, or some of her beauty, as the Quran puts it in this verse. So for obviously with different degrees of allowability, the Quran mentions, for example, children, and then it mentions also the male servants who have no need of women. And apparently what this might refer to is that in traditional Muslim societies, you have the inner quarters where only the women the women would dwell, and strange men, non-related to these women, would not have access to these inner quarters. But there were servants, especially now for our discussion, male servants, who would be allowed, and from whom the women would feel no danger or any sort of discomfort if they came in and out bringing food or whatever the case is. These were especially male servants who the Quran now puts it, those male servants who have no need of women. So who were they? They could be, in ancient times, they were eunuchs, people who emasculated themselves. And more broadly, now if we think about what we know and try to retroject it back to this Quranic situation, it may also refer to persons who were, though physically male, were known to not be of any danger to the women, and particularly if they didn't look at women in a way that made them uncomfortable, or they just were known to be men who did not feel any attraction, physical attraction, to the women.
So then, if we know that this sort of, I guess this idea of having homosexual orientation was something that has been sort of alluded to, then how do we, as a Muslim community, sort of create a safe space and foster that, within our communities, and be able to have a not proper, but a healthy conversation about this topic?
Yeah, regardless of the specific interpretation of that Quranic verse, more generally, Muslims are like anybody else. We are informed by all modern developments. We get a better sense of the world around us. We understand human nature a bit better than some of our predecessors did. Given that understanding, and now add that to our general appreciation for Quranic core values such as being kind in our treatment of other human beings, understanding human beings as they are, appreciating people, and not finding fault in others, but rather finding fault in ourselves and looking for the good in other people. We need to create an inclusive environment in our community so that people of all shades can come in and feel at home. We want our worship spaces to be accessible so that people can come in and comfortably worship God. The only thing we would not tolerate within our worship spheres is that kind of activity which takes away from the sanctity of the environment or disturbs the worship ceremonies or something like this. But other than that, we welcome people to come in as they are and to sincerely worship God without violating any of the precepts of our worship services.
Are there any penalties in the Islamic Sharia for someone who identifies himself or herself with a homosexual orientation?
In some traditional books, it is mentioned that the scholars pondered this issue, and partly they did not have anything clear to go on. Like if we think about the penalty for theft, for example, this is clearly stated in the Quran, that the hand of the thief should be cut. If we think about the penalty for adultery, this is clearly mentioned in the Quran as a number of lashes, 100. Of course, the stipulations and when and how to apply this and so on, this is a separate discussion. But no specific penalty was mentioned for homosexual acts except for what I mentioned previously about that verse of the Quran, which could possibly refer to homosexual acts, but there no specific penalty was mentioned, though it was said to punish them both. And that could be two persons who committed some acts of sexual immorality, maybe short of actual intercourse, because if it were intercourse, then it would be 100 lashes, but short of that, it could be some discretionary punishment. So to be more clear, in the Islamic Sharia in traditional times, the distinction was made between the had punishments, like fixed punishments mentioned in the Quran, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, what is referred to as ta'zir, or a kind of punishment that is discriminatory. The judge would award some kind of punishment as a deterrence, so that more serious crimes are not contemplated or committed. So in short, nothing specific is mentioned about that in the Quran. Now, when Muslim scholars pondered this, they got hold of a hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that would prescribe a punishment, but this is not deemed to be an authentic narrative from the Prophet, peace be upon him. It looks like this came more as a result of Muslim scholars thinking about the issue, and by analogy, they said that the people of Lot were punished in this particular way, that their entire city was lifted up by the angel and then thrown over on its head. So the penalty, by analogy, they said, was to take the homosexual person up to on a mountain and then throw him over I know that sounds ghastly. That's what they ruled, but this is not something that is in the Quran, and it is not in any authentic narrative back to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and Muslims today should not apply such a horrific punishment, especially in the case of a person who we know to be, I mean, we have to look at it from the other direction and say that persons of homosexual orientation really are going through some severe test in that most other persons would have the legal outlet for their urges in the form of a recognizable marriage within the Sharia, whereas on the other hand, a homosexual person would not have the same sort of legal outlet. And so we can only say that such a person is going through a tremendous test, and if such a person exercises patience and refrains from any sexual immorality, then such a person will get a greater degree of reward than, let's say, a heterosexual person who is also going through some test and maintaining patience in the face of such trials.
Is this how other religions also view homosexuality, or do they have a different take on things?
The book Ethical Issues in Six World Religions by Morgan and Lawton traces the views of six religions, as the title shows. On the one hand, there are the Eastern religions like Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, and then the Western religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And all of these religions, in one way or another, proscribe homosexual acts, at least in their traditional forms, the religions in their traditional forms. In all of these religions, you have some individuals in modern times arguing for a reform or a new way of looking at this, but the traditional forms do keep a very strong hold on the proscription of intimate homosexual acts. The strongest we find is what is mentioned in the Bible, and thus having a bearing on both Judaism and Christianity, at least as far as we speak of the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, in chapter 18, verse 22, we find a prescription against male homosexuality. And in chapter 20, verse number 13, even the death penalty is prescribed for male homosexual intimate acts. Nothing seems to be mentioned about female homosexuality here. In the New Testament, and this now is specific to Christianity, we find in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 27, that both male and female homosexual acts are condemned. And in the book 1 Corinthians, in chapter 6, verse number 9, again, both forms of homosexual behavior is given as one of the reasons for excluding a person from the grace of God.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
That was very helpful in contextualizing the conversation on homosexuality.
I'm glad that I was able to make sense of such a complex issue.
Thanks.